Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 4 o'clock, so we will get started. And welcome to week number 7. This is our final Zoom session for PPA 500. I warned you a few weeks ago that these courses go by very quickly in the hybrid variety, and so we are all done with our Zoom sessions after tonight. We'll cover all the information remaining tonight that will then be covered on that final assessment that we took a look at last week. And so after tonight's class, you'll have all the information that you need to complete the final assessment. So tonight is our final Zoom session. Then your final assessment is the last thing you have due in this course. You've already finished all your Canvas essays. So that final assessment is then due by midnight next Tuesday. And like I said, once we finish our material tonight, we'll have covered all the material that you need in order to do an outstanding job on that final assessment that is due next Tuesday. So that is where we are. And again, we're just about done. But what we talked about a couple of weeks ago is we kind of started this discussion of the functions of public administration. And we started talking about some of the tangible types of activities that public administrators are involved in. We talked about the function of leading and managing public organizations, and we did that through our discussion of the evolution of the public organization theory literature, talking about how we view organizations and how that then influences how we manage those organizations. Then last week, we talked about some additional functions. We talked about what public administrators do in terms of the formulation, the implementation, and the evaluation of public policies and public programs, giving you some insight into your PPA 670 policy analysis course you'll be taking in the future, as well as PPA 696 research methods, with our discussion of how we evaluate public programs. So where we are now is we have two final functions to talk about in this course: managing human resources, which will give you the insight into PPA 577, and then managing fiscal resources, which will give you insight into PPA 555, public budgeting and finance. So those are our final two functions that we talk about, and then that wraps up all the information we typically cover here in the 500 course to get you ready to then go forth and succeed in the rest of the MPA program and all of your future core and elective courses. All right, sounds good. All right, let's go ahead then and get into the discussion of the management of human resources. And a few weeks ago, we spent a lot of time talking about the differences between the public and private sectors and differences between public and private sector organizations. One of those primary differences that we discuss is that in the private sector, employees tend to be at-will employees. They are hired at the will of the organization. They serve at the will of the organization. It's much easier to terminate an at-will employee in the private sector than it is to terminate a career civil servant in the public sector. So as public sector employees, the vast majority of public sector employees are going to be within this career civil service. This career civil service, as we know, bestows upon employees more protections against arbitrary and capricious dismissal. That when you are in the career civil service, you have these career civil service protections whereby you will be evaluated based upon your performance, and then you will retain your job based on that performance, and you cannot be dismissed for arbitrary or political reasons. So what I'd like to do to start out our discussion of the management of human resources tonight is to really kind of look at this system of career civil service, where the system of civil service came from, why we developed the system of civil service, and then talk about what the civil service system looks like primarily at the federal level, because most states have modeled their civil service systems off of what goes on at the federal level of government. So we know that we have not always had a career civil service system. We read the Woodrow Wilson article, and in that article, Wilson talked to us about how the US adopted the civil service system from other nations such as Britain. And so Wilson was writing that article in 1887. He was writing it 4 years after the federal government adopted a career civil service system. And so what he told us is, prior to that, we didn't hire people based upon their merit. We didn't hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. We hired people based upon other characteristics instead. So at the founding of the nation, in the late 1700s. It was a fledgling national government. A lot of people were not sure that this national government would persist. They were concerned that this national government would go out of existence. Today, for the most part, we know we go to bed tonight, we're going to wake up tomorrow morning, and we expect that there will be a national government. We expect that there will be a national bureaucracy, that there'll be a Congress, that there'll be a presidency, that there will be a Supreme Court. We anticipate that these are enduring institutions that will persist from year to year. It wasn't that same expectation in the late 1700s. Indeed, when you think about even the early 1800s, we were again at war with Britain. In the War of 1812, we had British soldiers who were actually burning the US Capitol as part of the War of 1812. So there was a lot of concern about the viability of this new national government. So when we hired people in the late 1700s and the early 1800s to work in the national bureaucracy, we were hiring people for the purpose of reassuring the public that the work of the national government was real and it was legitimate and it would continue to be ongoing. So the way in which we hire people is we hire people based upon essentially their social standing. So he wanted to hire these, what were known as gentlemen. And so the reason why that's called the era of gentlemen, because we were hiring the people from the upper echelon of society, people who came from the quote unquote best family backgrounds, from the best social standing, from the best academic institutions. Thought was by hiring these gentlemen, we will then add legitimacy to this new national government. So from the founding of the nation up to the 1820s, our approach to hiring people to work as public administrators was this era of gentlemen. So we were essentially hiring people based upon who they were. Then, if any of you are students of American history, you're probably familiar with the very contentious presidential election of 1824. In 1824, we had multiple candidates running for the presidency. We had John Quincy Adams, and we had Andrew Jackson, we had Henry Clay, and others. When we have multiple people running for the presidency, it makes it more difficult for one of those candidates to get a majority of the Electoral College. So what happened in 1824 is Andrew Jackson was by far the most successful of the candidates. He won more popular votes than anyone else did, and he won a plurality of the Electoral College. Problem was he did not win a majority in the Electoral College. We know from our reading of the Constitution all those many weeks ago that in this Electoral College, in order to win the presidency, you need to win a majority of the electors in that Electoral College. If no one wins a majority of the Electoral College votes, then the election goes into the House of Representatives. And then it's left to the House of Representatives to then select the president. When the House of Representatives selects the president, it will do so by each congressional delegation getting one vote. So it doesn't matter how large that congressional delegation is. Here in California, we have the largest House delegation in the country. We would have the same number of votes won in the selection of the president as Wyoming would have, that has one representative. So each delegation gets one vote. So what happened in that discussion in the House about who should be president is you have this agreement that was reached between two of your candidates, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Henry Clay came out of the House of Representatives. Henry Clay was a Speaker of the House. He was very well known and regarded within the House of Representatives. So he had his own basis of support in the House. The agreement that was reached between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay was that if Henry Clay got his supporters to back John Quincy Adams for president, then once Adams became president, he would then appoint Henry Clay to a cabinet position. Now, later on, John Quincy Adams denied this and said this didn't happen, but Henry Clay supporters all supported John Quincy Adams. That allowed John Quincy Adams to have enough congressional delegation support to then be selected president. Once John Quincy Adams became president, lo and behold, he appointed Henry Clay to a cabinet position, and not just any old cabinet position, but to the position of Secretary of State. So that came to be known as the corrupt bargain in 1824. Obviously, a lot of people were very upset about this corrupt bargain. The person who was most upset was obviously Andrew Jackson, because he had won more popular and electoral votes than anyone else, and he had been shut out of the presidency. So 4 years later, in 1828, we have a rematch between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. This time, Andrew Jackson won not only a majority of the popular vote, but also a majority of the Electoral College. And by winning a majority of the Electoral College, then Andrew Jackson obviously then became president. When Jackson ascended to the presidency, he brought with him a different philosophy about government service than we had in the era of gentlemen. In the era of gentlemen, the assumption was in order to effectively and efficiently do the work of government, you had to be someone from the upper crust of society, one of these gentlemen from the best academic backgrounds. Those are the people who were, quote unquote, qualified to do the work of government. Andrew Jackson disagreed with that. Andrew Jackson believed that any average ordinary citizen was capable of doing the work of government. He really believed in what was known as the everyman. And so he really brought with him this idea that you didn't have to be from the upper crust of society in order to serve in the national bureaucracy. He was also a very ardent partisan. He really did believe that the winning political party should then be able to dole out positions in the national bureaucracy. The old adage, to the victor go the spoils. So the winning candidate, the winning party could then appoint their own people to then populate the national bureaucracy. That approach in 1828 then led to our second era of public employment, which was known as the era of spoils or the era of patronage. So you win the election, you then reward your followers, you reward those who helped you get elected by giving them positions in the national government. We saw this era of spoils and era of patronage not only going on in the national level, but we also saw it going on at state and local levels as well. When we talked about accountability and ethics several weeks ago, I shared an excerpt with you from this book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall, the memoirs of George Washington Plunkett, this individual who worked in the biggest political machine that we ever had in New York City called Tammany Hall. And in some of those writings, Plunkett gave some advice to young people in terms of if you want to get a job in government, this is what you need to do. And his advice in his memoirs, he said that if you want to get a job in government, do not go to college. Do not fill your head with what he called, quote unquote, college rot. Instead of filling your head with college rot, go out there and find a candidate to support. Learn how to round up votes for that candidate. And then if you're successful at getting that candidate elected, that's how you'll then be rewarded with a job in government. So we have the era of patronage, the era of spoils going on, not just at the national level, but at state and local levels as well. The problem with the era of spoils is when you have these people who are getting their jobs as public administrators based upon how well they can get somebody elected, the skill set it takes to get a candidate elected are not necessarily the same skill sets that it takes to effectively govern. And so these people were going into these positions and they did not have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to do the increasing complex work of government. So we ended up having a lot of inefficiencies. We had a lot of corruption, a lot of malfeasance and misfeasance. And so over the years, all this misfeasance and malfeasance really started to take a toll on people. And people really started to distrust government. They saw it as just being corrupt. And so at the local level in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, we started to see these good government movements that started to percolate up and the creation of these things called municipal leagues. And these municipal leagues at local government level would start putting forth these proposals to reform the bureaucracy. So we start hiring people based upon their merit as opposed to their political affiliation. The problem, though, is that was going on at the local level, but we really didn't have a lot of movement in that regard at the national level. We know from our discussion of public policy that typically to make a major change to a public policy, we usually have to have some type of a triggering event. Some major event has to happen that will galvanize public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change to this policy. The gentleman you see there on your screen there is Representative Pendleton. And Pendleton, for many years, carried around with him in his coat pocket draft legislation that would usher in an era of merit, an era of civil service at the national level. But he wasn't able to get much traction in Congress. So he was really struggling to try and find a way to get his bill introduced. Then the triggering event occurred. The triggering event that occurred was the assassination of President James Garfield. So Garfield ran in the election of 1880, and he won the office of the presidency. Then less than a year later, he was assassinated, and he was assassinated by a man named Charles J. Guiteau. Guiteau was a big believer in the era of spoils. Guiteau had written some campaign speeches for Garfield. There's no evidence that Garfield ever read any of these speeches, let alone used them in his campaign. There's also very little evidence that Garfield even knew who Charles Guiteau was. However, Guiteau, in kind of his tortured logic, felt, I wrote these speeches, I helped get Garfield elected to the presidency, and so therefore I am due. I am due to be rewarded with an office because it's the era of spoils after all. And Guiteau wanted an office no less than being ambassador to France. Obviously, he did not get ambassador to France. He didn't get any offer of a position from the Garfield administration. So Guiteau felt if he assassinated Garfield, Garfield's vice president was a man named Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was a big believer in the era of spoils. And so Guiteau felt, assassinate Garfield, Arthur becomes president, and since Arthur believes in spoils, Arthur will give me my job. He assassinated Garfield, Arthur ascended to the presidency. All that Guiteau got for his assassination of Garfield was an execution. And so Guiteau was executed publicly for his assassination of Garfield, but it really led to a lot of public outcry. It was a galvanizing type of event that then made people think, we really need to think long and hard about this era of spoils and how we hire people to work in the national bureaucracy. That was the trigger event that allowed Pendleton to introduce his legislation into Congress. Eventually, it would be passed by Congress and signed by the president as what came to be known as the Pendleton Act. With the adoption of the Pendleton Act in 1883, we now transition from the era of spoils into the era of merit. Now we're hiring people not based upon who they know, as we did in the era of spoils. Now we're hiring people based upon what they know. We're hiring them based upon their merit, their knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job they're being hired for. And so this Pendleton Act in 1883 occurred 4 years before Woodrow Wilson wrote his famous article advocating for a civil service system and advocating for the separate study of public administration. Remember in the Wilson article, Wilson said that if we could put together this politics administration dichotomy, we could then borrow civil service systems from England and innovations that England had been using, things such as examinations. And so in the Pendleton Act, we borrowed those examinations and we started using examinations as the tool to measure whether or not someone had the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities for the job. Remember for our discussion of Wilson, Wilson also told us that we had to take the closed system of examinations that was used in England and modify it into a more open system of examinations so that anyone could then sit for this examination. So these exams are open to anyone who is interested in taking them. So people would then take these examinations. Those examinations would be scored. Those individuals who scored the best on those examinations would then be hired into the national bureaucracy. And we have this era of merit really beginning at the national level in 1883. Another major element of the Pendleton Act in this era of merit was that not only are we going to hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, but we are also going to protect them from political influence. So we are going to make sure that they not only get their jobs, but they keep their jobs based upon their performance. So we are insulating them from political influence. We're going to protect them from the influences of partisanship. Well, it's one thing to protect these bureaucrats, these public administrators, from the influences of politics. But then what happens when these administrators actually then start playing politics while they are on the job? And we saw in the early 1900s, a lot of these bureaucrats were campaigning and using their public offices to advocate for candidates and for political parties. So much so that we knew we had to place a limitation upon that. And so we ended up getting this Hatch Act in 1939, 1940. The Hatch Act at the federal level then prohibited public administrators, these bureaucrats, from engaging in political activities while on the job, or prohibit them from using any of their public resources to benefit an individual candidate or a political party. So you're really requiring these administrators now that if we're going to protect you from political influence, we are also going to place limitations on you in terms of your ability to engage in politics as a public servant. So if you want to play politics, you have to do it on your own time, at your own house, using your own private resources. You can't use your public resources for political types of activities. Once we had this federal Hatch Act, we then saw all the states start to fall in line with their own little Hatch Acts. Here in California, our current, what you would consider to be kind of a little Hatch Act, is the Political Reform Act of 1974. And the Political Reform Act of 1974 empowers the Fair Political Practices Commission, the FPPC here in California, with the authority to sanction, to oversee and then to sanction any political types of activities that are being done using public resources. And so that's kind of the way in which we do it here in California. So from 1883 onward, we kind of have this era of merit where we're hiring people based upon what they know, based upon their skills and their abilities. The problem, though, subsequent to 1883, the Pendleton Act, is every few years, Congress would tinker with the Pendleton Act, and they would pass new superseding legislation that would add on new limitations or new regulations on top of what the Pendleton Act already had in place. So you kind of had all this piecemeal legislation that was being passed by Congress subsequent to 1883. So much so that when we get to the 1970s, there was a lot of confusion among public administrators at the national level in terms of what they could and what they could not do. There was so much confusion that we decided we needed to really reform the era of merit and reform the national bureaucracy in 1978 with this piece of legislation known as the Civil Service Reform Act. And it's really the Civil Service Reform Act that gives us our modern system of civil service. So the Carter administration passed and he signed the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978. The purpose of the Civil Service Reform Act was to sort out some of the confusion that a lot of administrators had in terms of what was legal, what was not legal for them to do, but also to put some tangible protections in place for people if they felt that their merit principles were being violated. So if you are a public administrator, you're working in the national bureaucracy, and you get demoted or you get denied some promotional opportunity because you belong to a different political party than your manager does, that's obviously going to be a violation of your career civil service protections. But what do? How do you bring that to light? How do you have that problem rectified? Well, that's something the Civil Service Reform Act tried to take care of. And it did it through the creation of 5 different entities. And you see all those entities, the acronyms for them listed there on the screen for you. The first entity that came out of the Civil Service Reform Act was the OPM. And the OPM stands for the Office of Personnel Management. And the Office of Personnel Management was designed to kind of be the central clearinghouse for the hiring of people into the federal bureaucracy. So people are getting hired based upon their performance on these examinations. Well, someone needs to develop the exams, and someone needs to administer the exams. Someone needs to score the exams. And so that then becomes the job of the Office of Personnel Management. So we kind of centralize the recruitment and the hiring process within the Office of Personnel Management to make sure that we are truly hiring people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So what OPM would do is they would administer these examinations, they would score these examinations, and then based upon the results of those scores, they would then create what's called a list of three or a list of five. An eligibility list. Sometimes it's called a rule of three or a rule of five. An eligibility list of either the top three scores or the top five scores on that examination, depending upon how many applicants there were. Then the hiring agency could only interview and hire off of that eligibility list that was provided to them by the Office of Personnel Management. So this was very much a centralization of the hiring process within this Office of Personnel Management. Then the second organization that was created to kind of sort out all these problems we have with the era of merit was the MSPB, which stands for the Merit System Protection Board. And I'll try and put all this in text chat as I talk. Labana, go ahead.
A quick question. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, quick question about the OPM because they are obviously probably supposed to like hire in a more unbiased manner, but where did they develop or who I guess like developed the I don't know, I want to say like the requisites, maybe like the guidelines for like how to hire those people. Like if you're saying that you want to hire them based on knowledge, skills, and abilities, like who were the people in place or like how did they come to kind of like list out this is exactly like what we want to hire by, if that question kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It makes perfect sense. That's a really good question. And that would be an OPM responsibility as well. So what OPM would do is whenever an agency had a vacancy that they want to fill, the agency would contact OPM. They would then tell OPM, here's the position, and they would provide OPM with the requisite knowledge and skills that were required of someone to do this position effectively. Then OPM would incorporate that into the vacancy announcement and would put all those required skills in that vacancy announcement. And then that vacancy announcement would then be issued by OPM to then invite people to apply for this position and take the examination. So that's how that would all work. And OPM had responsibility over those vacancy announcements, the advertising of those positions. And so it's all part, knowing the types of knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required of a job. That really comes out of one of the functions of human resource management, which is the allocation type of function. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but we need to make sure that for each of these positions that we are hiring for, that we know exactly what the minimum qualifications are, what the preferred qualifications are, and then those minimum and preferred qualifications need to be embodied within that vacancy announcement so that people can kind of self-screen and determine whether or not they feel they have the requisite skills to even apply for this position and take the examination to begin with. And the problem we ran into, though, with that is that it's one thing to put these knowledge, skills, abilities, these minimum and preferred qualifications into a vacancy announcement. It's a completely different thing to then design an examination that will, in a valid way, measure whether or not someone has those knowledge, skills, and abilities. The problem with examinations, and the examination that used to be used at the federal level was known as the PACE exam, PACE. And the problem is that some of those examinations were not what we consider to be valid, in that they did not really represent the skills needed to be successful on the job. And so a lot of these examinations suffer from problems with validity. And there are different types of validity that we're concerned with examinations. So for just very quickly, for one instance, content validity is something we're very interested in. Examinations, the content of the examination must match up with the content of the job. So if you're hiring for a custodial position, but then the examination that you are using tests for higher order calculus or something like that that is not really necessary for doing the job of the custodian, that exam does not have content validity. Sometimes these examinations that were developed by OPM lack that type of content validity. So, because of all those problems with those examinations, we have in recent years moved away from the use of examinations and kind of decentralized the hiring process. So now we're starting to use just a more holistic view of someone's knowledge, skills, and abilities as evidenced by their resume, by their education, by their experience. But OPM had that responsibility for identifying here are the minimum and preferred qualifications, and then trying to make sure the examination would then test for those types of knowledge, skills, and abilities. But at that time in 1978, it was a very centralized process, everything centralized within the Office of Personnel Management. Today is far more decentralized than it was back in the 1970s. So that's a great question. The second organization I was created, the Merit Systems Protection Board, it was created for the purpose of protecting your merit protections, protecting your merit principles. So if an employee felt that they were being demoted or that they had some type of reprisal against them that was not based upon their performance, that was something political, then they could take their case to the Merit Systems Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board would then be kind of a quasi judiciary investigatory type of body where they would receive your claim, they would go out there and investigate your claim. And if they found that there was credibility to your claim, that yes, indeed, your merit principles are being violated, that you are being treated for something other than your performance, then they could then offer some corrective action. So say, for instance, that you were demoted and you were being demoted not because of your performance, but because of some political disagreements or something like that. Merit System Protection Board could come in and say, this person needs to be reinstated to their original position and they need to be provided with back pay as well. So whatever pay they lost by being demoted, they need to get that back pay with interest and be put back into their initial position. Those are, those kind of corrective efforts that the Merit System Protection Board can do if they see violations of those merit principles. In terms of what Merit System Protection Board did, it could deal with workplace harassment, could deal with retaliation if it was a case that was brought by an individual who was directly affected by that case. However, if it was retaliation against an employee that came about because that employee was a whistleblower, so that employee saw some violation of merit going on and they then blew the whistle on it. It didn't really affect them directly, but they saw it affecting one of their colleagues. In those instances, those whistleblowers, instead of going to the Merit System Protection Board, they would go to this third organization, the OSC, which is the Office of Special Counsel. And the Office of Special Counsel, put that in text chat, Office of Special Counsel had the responsibility of dealing with these issues of whistleblowing. So if you had a whistleblower and that whistleblower felt that because they blew the whistle, they are now being subjected to some type of retribution and retaliation, then the Office of Special Counsel would investigate that claim and could then again offer some corrective actions to make the person whole and protect the person from future retaliation. One of the problems, though, with the Office of Special Counsel is that when it was originally created in 1978, it was created as part of the Merit System Protection Board. So it was within the Merit System Protection Board, which means it did not have its own budget and it did not have its own staff. So there was a massive backlog of cases that the OSC was facing pretty much immediately upon its creation. We realized we had to do something about this backlog of cases. And so about 10 years, 12 years later, in the Whistleblowers Act, which we talked about when we talked about accountability and ethics, the Whistleblowers Act pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit Systems Protection Board and made it its own standalone agency with its own staff and its own budget. And that has helped the Office of Special Counsel kind of catch up on this backload of whistleblower claims that they have to deal with on a daily basis. So if there's a merit problem that affected you individually, you could go to the Merit System Protection Board. If it was a problem that you were blowing the whistle on that affected someone else in the organization, then you would go to the Office of Special Counsel. So again, by creating these organizations, we are hopefully creating a clear path so that as administrators know if their merit principles or someone else's merit principles are being violated, they know exactly to whom to go to then air these grievances. Before the Civil Service Reform Act, it wasn't really clear what you do if you saw violations of merit principles. Then we have a fourth organization that's created out of the Civil Service Reform Act known as the FLRA, and that stands for the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And the Federal Labor Relations Authority had the ultimate control over the collective bargaining process at the federal level. So we know that we have high rates of unionization in the public sector. We have mentioned in a previous class that public sector employees tend to be unionized at least 3 times the rate of their private sector counterparts. So we've got a lot of these public sector employee unions, and these employee unions are all engaging in this collective bargaining process. Well, someone has to oversee that collective bargaining process, and that's the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So say, for instance, you have a negotiation going on, a collective bargaining process going on, and the employee bargaining unit wants a 5% raise. So their first offer to management is for a 5% raise. Management then counters with a 2% raise. The employee union then comes back and counters that offer with a 4% raise. Then the management comes back and says, well, you know what? We're mad. So instead of a 2% raise, we're going to counter with a 1% raise. You can't do that in collective bargaining. That's something in collective bargaining that's known as regressive bargaining. Once you have made an offer, you then cannot follow up with a worse offer than the offer that you previously made. So that type of regressive bargaining on the part of management could be considered to be what's called an unfair labor practice. So the bargaining unit would say, this is an unfair labor practice that management's engaging in. And so we're going to take this claim of this unfair labor practice to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Labor Relations Authority will then investigate that and will come to a determination as to whether or not that was an unfair labor practice. If it was an unfair labor practice, they can sanction the agency, they can fine the agency. There are a lot of corrective actions that they can take to try and make sure that the agency does not engage in these types of unfair labor practices in the future. Another possible example of an unfair labor practice is if there's a group of employees who want to unionize. So they want to get together and put together a union, put together their bargaining unit, and the agency tries to stop them from doing that. Kind of this union busting type of approach. That could also be considered to be an unfair labor practice, and that could go then to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Now, one of the problems that the Federal Labor Relations Authority had is that it had a public relations problem. It was created in 1978, and about 3 years later, we had a very high-profile collective bargaining issue that it had to deal with. In the early part of the Reagan administration, we had air traffic controllers who decided to go on strike. And so the Air Traffic Controllers Union went ahead and declared a strike. Reagan said, this is a public safety position. We can't afford to have air traffic controllers not being on the job. So if you go on strike, I will fire you and I will replace you with new air traffic controllers. With the air traffic controllers, many of them went on strike anyway, and so the Reagan administration fired them for going on strike. The Air Traffic Controllers Union said that's a violation, that's an unfair labor practice. So they took their case to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. Federal Labor Relations Authority sided with the Reagan administration, said that Reagan had the ability to fire these air traffic controllers because this had a direct impact upon public safety. What that did is it had a very chilling effect among a lot of public employee unions across the federal government. And they felt that, well, the Federal Labor Relations Authority, it's always going to be on the side of administration. And so Federal Labor Relations Authority has really been fighting for many years against that perception that they are much more aligned with administration than they are with public sector employee unions. Here in California, the corollary to the Federal Labor Relations Authority is what's called CalPERB. So here in California, we call it California PERB, PERB. And PERB stands for the employee related the personnel employee relations public employee relations board. So it's a California Public Employee Relations Board, CalPERB. And the Employee Relations Board has a similar responsibility at the state level as the FLRA has at the national level. So if you are in negotiations with a state or a local agency, you feel they're engaging in unfair labor practice, you can then take that claim to CalPERB. CalPERB will investigate it and will then render a decision and perhaps issue sanctions against that agency if it truly is found to be an unfair labor practice. Now, for the Federal Labor Relations Authority, they cover pretty much all federal employee unions with the exception of the post office. Postal workers, instead of being under the FLRA, they are under the NLRB, which is the National Labor Relations Board. And the National Labor Relations Board is kind of the private sector counterweight to the FLRA is in the public sector. The reason why postal employees are under the auspices of the NLRB is because they are a government corporation. As a government corporation, they kind of act and function similar to a private corporation. So Congress has placed them under the National Labor Relations Board, but all other traditional types of agencies in the federal level are then under the FLRA. And then finally, the fifth entity that's created is what's known as the Senior Executive Service, the SES or the Senior Executive Service. One of the things that we had found is that even though we are in this era of merit, we are really kind of in a hybrid system in that the vast majority of people who work in agencies and departments are career civil servants with career civil service protections. However, at the very top leadership levels in these agencies and departments, we have political appointees. So we have people who are appointed by the president, and in some cases, confirmed by the Senate. These are your secretaries and undersecretaries of departments. These are your directors of federal agencies. As political appointees, they are put in their position by the president. So it's kind of a era of spoils type of arrangement. But that's only for your very top leaders in the organization. 99.9% of everyone else is going to be a career civil servant. The problem there is that you have this disconnect, whereby your political appointees are there to serve the president and to serve the president's policy ambitions, and then your career civil servants are there for a career. So they're not as interested in those policy aspirations of the president. They're more interested in effective and efficient policy and program implementation. So whenever the president puts a political appointee in place and tells them to do something that runs counter to what the rest of the organization wants to do, those career civil servants are going to say, I'm here for a career, so I'm just going to wait you out. You're a political appointee. You're here for maybe 18, 24, 36 months. You're not going to be here that long. You're going to be gone. Your president's going to be gone in the intervening election. I'm still going to be here. And so it made it very difficult for political appointees to lead all these career civil servants in these organizations. So the idea here is let's try and bridge that gap. And they tried to bridge the gap with this senior executive service. And the way in which a senior executive service works. The career civil service system at the federal level is really oriented around what's known as the general schedule. The general schedule is the position classification system of the federal government. So every position, every civil service position at the federal level will have a general schedule level. It will have a GS level. The general schedule runs from, or at this in 1978 ran from a GS1 all the way up to a GS18. Now, you don't have a lot of GS1 and 2 people. For the most part, it kind of really functionally starts about GS3. A GS3 type of employee would typically be a student on an internship, student jobs. Those are typically at that GS3 type of level. GS5 through 7s were your kind of entry level positions. GS8 through 12s were kind of your mid-level positions. GS13 to 15 were your kind of upper level supervisory positions. And then your GS16 through 18 Those were your top leadership positions just below political appointees. So what we did, or what Congress decided to do, is take those GS 16, 17, and 18 employees, this very top cadre of the career civil service, and put them into what's called the senior executive service. When you go from your GS 16 to 18 level and you go into the senior executive service, you are then going to be given things such as bonus pay. So if your organization performs better, if it starts achieving its goals and objectives, you will get paid for performance. You will get bonus pay based upon how well your organization is operating. So you got bonus pay. Another inducement to become part of the senior executive service is that you have more flexibility in terms of which agencies you work for. So if you work in the Department of Agriculture and you said, I really want to go and work in the Department of Health and Human Services, the lateral transfer process was very simple, very quick, and very easy. So those are the two incentives that these GS 16, 17, 18 employees had to join the senior executive service. However, when you join the senior executive service, you give up a lot of your career civil service protections. So you kind of become almost a quasi-political appointee. So you're kind of operating in this netherworld between political appointees and career civil servants. The problem with the senior executive service when it was created is that this bonus pay that Congress promised to the senior executive service members, this bonus pay never materialized. Because you think about the late 1970s and the early 1980s, every year we were running a budget deficit, and every year that budget deficit got bigger and bigger and bigger. We simply did not have enough revenue to support bonus pay. So every year Congress would promise bonus pay to these SESers, and every year they would then renege on their promise. So you ended up with a situation where you had a lot of disaffected, a lot of disappointed SESers. Even today, we've seen surveys done. Well, they'll survey senior executive service members and they'll say, if you had it to do over again, would you have joined the senior executive service? And many of them said no. When asked the question, would you advise a younger employee to join the senior executive service? About 70% say no, they would not advise it. But be that as it may, we still have the senior executive service that exists to try and bridge that gap between political appointees and the majority of our bureaucrats who are career civil servants. So today, the way in which the general schedule works is that it runs technically from GS1 up to GS15. Then above GS15, we then have positions known as Executive Service 1 through Executive Service 5 positions. And those are your senior executive service members in the Executive Service 1 through 5 positions. If you are at the GS 13, 14, or 15 level, some of these top level supervisory positions, and you aspire to be in the senior executive service, there is an executive training academy that you will be required to attend and graduate from. Then once you graduate from that academy, that would then qualify you to be appointed to the senior executive service. Again, on paper, it makes a lot of sense to have the senior executive service. It's just in practice, Congress never made good on its promises for bonus pay. So that's kind of our career civil service system that we have. In our system today, we're in an era of merit for the vast majority of our employees, but we still have that patronage in that we have those political appointees who lead our departments and our agencies at the very top level of those departments and those agencies. So it's kind of a hybrid system. The advantages of having career civil service, those advantages are obvious in that you are hiring people who have the skills to do the job. People keep their jobs based upon their performance. They're insulated from politics. And so it really is an advancement and improvement over the era of spoils. It helps to root out a lot of that corruption, helps to root out a lot of that inefficiency and ineffectiveness. The disadvantages of the career civil service system is it's very complex. So when you are managing your human resources in an organization, you not only have to be concerned about collective bargaining agreements, you also have to be concerned about these career civil service protections and endeavor not to violate these career civil service protections. So it has made the whole system of managing human resources extremely complex. Speaking of collective bargaining agreements, so as human resource managers, we have to worry about our civil service protections, but we also have to worry about the collective bargaining agreement that comes out of the negotiations process. As we've said, we know that public sector employees are unionized at much higher levels than private sector employees. So unions have had a major influence on what we do in public administration. Through that collective bargaining process, we will have a bargaining team representing the bargaining unit that will be the union that will then negotiate with the bargaining team from administration, from management to try and come to an agreement on this collective bargaining agreement, on this contract. The way in which this process works is going to depend upon whether you're looking at the federal level or the state level. And it's also going to depend upon which state you are looking at as well. So, give you an example. Collective bargaining at the federal level has a relatively limited scope of bargaining. And by scope of bargaining, we mean the types of issues that can be collectively bargained over. So, at the federal level, issues such as compensation are not subject to collective bargaining. They are not on the bargaining table. That seems weird to us because at the state and local level, that's the primary issue we usually negotiate over will be salary increases. But compensation at the federal level is not within the permissive scope of bargaining. That is because Congress establishes compensation for the federal government. There's a compensation commission that meets a couple of times per year. One of my colleagues from BYU, I believe he's still serving on the commission, but they meet a couple of times per year. They make recommendations to Congress in terms of if there should be compensation increases for federal employees, and if so, how much those compensation increases should be. But Congress has the final say about what people in the federal bureaucracy will make in terms of compensation. So you cannot collectively bargain over compensation. In the vast majority of states, compensation, as I said, is probably the number one issue that is negotiated over in the collective bargaining process. Some states have very permissive scopes of bargaining in that they allow bargaining over a large array of issues. Some have much more restrictive scopes of bargaining. Here in California, the scope of bargaining is relatively permissive. Wisconsin, traditionally, because of its strong union ties and union background, oftentimes has a very permissive scope of bargaining. Your more restrictive scope of bargaining is oftentimes going to be in southern states. So if you compare like Wisconsin's scope of bargaining to Alabama's, you'll find that Alabama has a much more restrictive scope, fewer issues that can be collectively bargained over. So the two sides come together in this collective bargaining process. The hope is that both sides will come together with the goal of trying to come to an agreement. It's not always the case. Sometimes one party is not nearly as predisposed to coming to an agreement as another party. So we oftentimes have what we call an impasse. An impasse is when the bargaining stalls and either one or both parties decide that they need help in getting this bargaining process restarted. That's what's called an impasse. So if one side declares an impasse, then the bargaining stops. And then at that point, we then have to employ some impasse resolution strategies to try and get to an agreement. So if we have an impasse in bargaining, one of the ways in which we resolve that is through what's called fact finding. Fact finding is when you'll bring in a third party, objective, neutral person, a fact finder. The fact finder will come in and we'll look at everything that's happened in that collective bargaining process. We'll literally just look at all the facts of what's been done, what offers have been made by both sides, and we'll then write a fact finder report. That fact finder report is non-binding. It's literally just this fact finder's recollections and of the research that they've done in terms of all the facts and everything that's gone on in that collective bargaining process. Once that fact finder report is completed, it is then embargoed for 2 weeks, which means that it only goes to the union and to management. And only the union and only the management have the ability to review that fact finder report for that 2 week period of time. Once those 2 weeks expire, then the fact finder report becomes public, and then members of the public and members of the media can read that fact finder report. The reason why we embargo those reports for 2 weeks is to hopefully kind of light a fire under one of the two parties to come to an agreement before this fact finder report goes public. Because chances are that fact finder report is going to make one side look worse than the other side. And so if you're the side that doesn't look good in that fact finder report, it probably behooves you to work really hard to come to an agreement before that report would then go public. Because once you come to an agreement and then the fact finder report is moot and it doesn't go public and it doesn't look bad on you. But that fact finder report is going to be non-binding. It doesn't necessarily guarantee we're going to come to a negotiated settlement. A second impasse resolution strategy is what's known as mediation. And the federal government has this organization known as the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, the FMCS, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. The Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service has trained mediators that, if requested, these mediators can then be sent out to these collective bargaining negotiations and try and work out an agreement between the two parties. Oftentimes, this is non-binding, but it's just an expert who can come in and hopefully get the two parties to come to an agreement. When I was in college, one of my political science professors was a federal mediator, and he had a contract with the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, and so he was constantly gone. We rarely had class because he was going all over the country doing this mediation in these different types of settings. But again, this is probably going to be non-binding. If you really need to come to an agreement, you'll need a binding impasse resolution strategy. And if you really want to come to an agreement, a binding resolution could be what's called final offer binding arbitration. I'll put that in text chat. I try and talk and type at the same time. Final offer binding arbitration. In final offer binding arbitration, an arbiter will come in and will say, union, give me your final offer. Management, give me your final offer. And they will then weigh those two offers and they'll select one of those offers. And the offer that the arbiter selects will then become the collective bargaining agreement. It's a high risk strategy because if your final offer isn't selected, then that means you're basically losing in the process, and the other party is going to have their offer that is adopted, but it will give you 100% certainty that you will have an agreement because it is final offer binding type of arbitration. So this is kind of usually your last step, that if you cannot come to an agreement, this is what you would do, hopefully to avoid a full-on strike. Obviously, if you can't come to any of these agreements, none of the impasse resolutions work, then you might authorize, you see the union authorize a strike and then have a work stoppage. Usually it'll be written into the contract, the existing collective bargaining agreement, that you have to try at least some impasse resolution before you're able to authorize a strike. And so we saw recently the California Faculty Association, the faculty union, was at an impasse with the Cal State system in their collective bargaining process. And before they could go on strike and have a work stoppage, they had to at least have a fact-finding report. So they brought in a fact finder, the fact finder put together the fact-finding report. And then as a result of that fact-finding report, you then had an agreement that was come to, I believe it was on the same day as the work stoppage was supposed to begin. But you have to at least exhaust one of these impasse resolution options before you can actually go on strike. And in some states, certain employees are not allowed to go on strike. And so in a lot of states, if it's a public safety type of position, those public safety employees are not allowed to go on strike. So if you're a police officer in some states, you are not authorized to go on strike. That's where you end up with things like blue flu and calling out sick and some of these unofficial work stoppages, because you cannot declare a strike if you have a direct relationship to the safety of the public. But when you overlay collective bargaining requirements on top of career civil service requirements, you again provide a lot of protection for these public employees. It also means that when you are managing your human resources, you have to be cognizant of not just career civil service protections, but also protections afforded in the collective bargaining agreement, which means that it has led to a lot of centralization within agencies. where agencies have really begun to centralize the human resource management function within offices of human resources. Idea being that those are your HR professionals. They're much more likely to be very well versed in both career civil service protections as well as collective bargaining agreements. And so they're less likely to violate some of these provisions than a line manager would be who is not a human resource professional. So it's really created a lot of job openings within agencies in these offices of human resources. But let's start to get into some of the nitty gritty of how we actually manage human resources in public organizations and the functions that we go through in managing these human resources. Obviously, the first function in human resource management is getting people with the knowledge, skills, and abilities into your organization. The way you do that is obviously through recruitment. Now, here is a big difference between public and private sectors. In the private sector, your primary goals are efficiency and effectiveness. In the public sector, in addition to efficiency and effectiveness, we also have the value of social equity. We also have the value of representative bureaucracy. We also have the value of protection of individual rights. And so we must be much more deliberate in the way in which we recruit in the public as compared to the private sector. So whereas an at-will employee in the private sector can be hired and start work the same day, in the public sector, it might take 3, 6, 9 months before you're able to hire an employee because there are a lot of steps you need to go through to make sure that you are abiding by the values of social equity and representative bureaucracy. So in the public sector, we do a lot more targeted recruitment where we will do targeted outreach to historically underrepresented populations to try and diversify our workforce in order to make our workforce more representative of the population that that workforce is serving. And so just to give you an example of our most recent recruitments that we have done here in the department, when I was chair, we recruited, a full-time tenured faculty member, a tenure track faculty member. We did that twice. In order to do that, we had to put together our vacancy announcement. And so in the vacancy announcement, we had to list, here is the position, the courses this person will be teaching, the type of research expectations, the minimum qualifications for this person, the preferred qualifications for this person. And then that became our vacancy announcement, our position announcement. We couldn't just advertise that position announcement, though. First, before it could be advertised, it had to be vetted and approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. So in their review, they had to make sure that it was an announcement that would encourage diversity in our applicant pool, would reiterate the department's and the university's commitment to social equity and social justice. And so that had to be in that announcement before it got approved by Equity and Diversity. Once it was approved, we then have to put together a recruitment plan. That recruitment plan would then list how we were going to advertise for this position and where we would advertise for the position. We had to advertise with targeted recruitment. And on the screen, I've listed for you some of the targeted recruitment sources that we use to advertise for our two most recent positions. The local government Hispanic network we advertise with, the American Society for Public Administration section for women in public administration, the National Forum of Black Public Administrators. Those are all targeted recruitment sources that we use in order to try and diversify our applicant pool. That recruitment plan would have to then be approved by Equity and Diversity before you could actually implement it. Then once you send out this announcement and you advertise, then when your applications come in, you have your applicant pool. That initial applicant pool has to be approved by Equity and Diversity to make sure it's sufficiently diverse. If Equity and Diversity finds that the initial pool is not sufficiently diverse, they will send you back to the drawing board. And they'll say, go back and you'll have to go out and re-advertise, maybe change the vacancy announcement a bit, maybe look for other targeted recruitment sources to advertise in, and you would have to start the process over again. Fortunately for us, our initial applicant pool both times was diverse enough and was approved by Equity and Diversity. Once it's approved by Equity and Diversity, then you have to put together the interview questions you're going to use to interview your semifinalists. Those interview questions have to be approved by Equity and Diversity, and your semifinalist pool also needs to be approved by Equity and Diversity for diversity. Once that pool gets approved, the semifinalist pool gets approved, then you do your Zoom interviews or phone interviews, however you're doing it, following that interview schedule that's been approved by equity and diversity. And you then identify your three finalists to be brought to campus for in-person interviews. Those three finalists then have to be approved by equity and diversity again. And then once you finally select one of those three people, that final selection has to be approved by the dean as well as equity and diversity and the provost. And then once that's approved, then you can make that offer to that individual. We started our processes in late July and we end up extending an offer in early March. And so you're looking at easily half a year there where we went through this target recruitment process so that we could hire the most diverse, get the most diverse applicant pool and hire the person who had the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job, but also someone who added to the diversity of our faculty, because that's always one of our goals in our strategic plan is to diversify our faculty, and that's something that with each faculty hire we try to do. So you can see the difference between recruiting in the public sector versus recruiting in the private sector. It's usually a much more protracted, much longer process, but certainly for good reason. In selecting that final applicant who will get the job offer, that takes us to our second function, which is the function of selection. So how do we select people? Today, we select people more holistically on a review of their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So when we talked about the creation of the Office of Personnel Management back in 1978, we said the Office of Personnel Management put together and administered the exams and scored the exams. We relied primarily on those examinations. As we had said, those examinations oftentimes are not completely valid. They lack content validity. Sometimes they lack concurrent and predictive validity, and it's beyond our scope to get into what all that is. You'll talk about that more when you get to 696. And we also know that a lot of these examinations had a lot of cultural bias built into them. So because it was so difficult to fashion examinations that were both valid as well as unbiased, we really started to decentralize the hiring process and start looking more holistically at resumes, education, experience, those knowledge, skills, and abilities. So today at the federal level, as well as in most states, we rely more on knowledge, skills, and abilities as compared to relying upon examinations. Now, this will depend. My favorite answer, it depends. It depends because it depends on the type of job. So if you're hiring for a computer scientist and has specific coding types of requirements for the job, you may still use an examination to make sure those specific skills are something that that applicant has. But for the most part, in a lot of our public administration positions, it's a much more holistic review of the application. One approach that some agencies several years ago started to implement was the approach of using assessment centers. Assessment centers are essentially the simulated work environments. So in these simulated work environments, what you would do is you would set up the simulated work environment oftentimes on a Saturday morning, and then you would bring in applicants into that environment and have them actually do the work in that environment that they would be doing on a daily basis if they were hired for the job. The problem with the assessment centers, twofold. One, they're very expensive and they're very time consuming. The second major problem is the Hawthorne effect. We talked about Elton Mayo and Elton Mayo's Hawthorne experiments. And we know the Hawthorne experiments led us to this phenomenon in research known as the Hawthorne effect. When you watch people, when you observe people, they behave differently than when you're not watching those people. So when you're watching people in an assessment center, they're going to be more productive and work harder than perhaps they would normally work if they were hired into the position. So because of all those problems, we kind of shy away from those assessment centers today, and we really rely upon that holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. Once we have selected the candidate and we onboard the candidate, we bring the candidate into the organization, then we have to engage in allocation and evaluation. So we bring the person in, we onboard them, we give them their training so that they get acclimated to the culture of the organization and what they're doing on a daily basis. But we have to allocate the work. So we have to decide who is doing what within our organization. This is where we get a lot of the artifacts that are left over from our good friend Frederick Taylor in scientific management. So we'll engage in things such as a job analysis. And I'm not going to go through, these are hyperlinked, but I'm not going to go through and show you examples of each of these. This is something you'll get in your 577 course, but kind of from that 30,000 foot level in this course. A job analysis is when we look at each individual position and deconstruct each position into its component elements. So say, let's take the position of police chief. And we'll ask the question, what does the police chief do on a daily basis? How much time does the police chief spend supervising officers? How much time does the police chief spend working with the budget, developing the budget? How much time does the police chief spend interfacing with external stakeholders? So that's just an example of some of the actual parts of this job. And then what percentage of time that person is spending on each element of that job. We'll do a job analysis like that for each and every position within our organization. Once we've conducted each one of these job analyses, we will then use the results of the job analysis for the purpose of a job evaluation. And in a job evaluation, what we then do is we are going to compare one job to another. So we'll say, okay, we'll take the job analysis we did for the job of police chief, and we're going to then compare it to the job analysis for the job of a patrol officer. And we'll compare how those two jobs differ. So in that job analysis and job evaluation, what we will then do is by comparing these different jobs, it will then allow us to place these jobs on our position classification system and then assign compensation based upon where those positions fall on that position classification system. So doing a job evaluation, we compare position to position. One of the most common ways in which we will do it is what's known as a point factor evaluation. And point factor job evaluations are still the most common type of evaluation because they are relatively intuitive and they're relatively simple to do. So the point factor evaluation, you'll ask the question again, based on your job analysis, what are the different aspects of the job? And then we will weight each of those different aspects. And so let's say, for instance, one aspect of the job of a police chief and a patrol officer is risk of physical harm. If you're a police chief, your risk of physical harm is probably much, much lower than the risk of physical harm for a patrol officer. So let's say risk of physical harm is worth 20% of the evaluation score. So for the police chief might get a 1 out of 10 on that. The patrol officer might get a 10 out of 10 on that. And so if the patrol officer gets 10 out of 10, it's worth 20%. They would get 2 points for it. You can kind of see how it works. Multiply the points times the weighting factor. Then we'll look at supervisory responsibility. That may be worth 40% of the job. Well, for the police chief, supervisory probably gets scored a 10 because they are the police chief and they're running the entire department. For the patrol officer, absent maybe supervising rookie patrol officers, they don't have nearly as much supervision. So maybe they get scored a 3 as opposed to the 10 that the police chief got. So you kind of get the idea. You multiply the point by the weighting factor, add up all those points, and then that will tell you where to place your positions in your position classification system. So ostensibly, the police chief position will probably have a much higher resulting score than the patrol officer position. So the police officer position is up here on the position classification, patrol officer is down here. Therefore, the police officer will be compensated much higher than the patrol officer. So we use this job evaluation to create our position classification systems and then assign pay grades to each one of those positions. We will then also take the results of our job analysis and use those results for the creation of a position description. Now, if you're currently working in a public organization or even in a private corporation, you probably have a job description. You have a position description. And that position description tells you what you do on a daily basis and how much time you spend doing those types of functions. So if you are a greeter, and so you're working at the front desk of this building, and you may have job functions such as greeting visitors as they enter the building. You may answer the phone. You may write correspondence. You may refer people to appropriate offices. Those may be the 4 functions that you do on a daily basis. Well, then in that position description, say what percentage of your time is spent in each one of those functions. That's what we call a traditional position description. What you're doing and how much time you spend doing those functions. However, a lot of organizations recently have started to move more toward what are called RODs, or results-oriented descriptions. In an ROD, you will incorporate performance expectations into that position description. So your first function is greeting visitors when they arrive, and that's worth 40% of your time. The expectation in terms of your performance is that every visitor gets greeted upon entering the building. That's the performance expectation. So if you forget or you miss greeting a person when they come in the building, you are not meeting your expectations in terms of your performance. Your other one may be answering the phone. And so the expectation may be that you answer phone calls no later than the second ring using the script provided. So if their phone rings 4, 5, 6 times, you're not meeting your performance expectations. So you kind of see the idea. And that the idea here with the results-oriented description is that you provide to your employees early on an indication of here are the performance levels that are expected of you in this job. If they know what the performance expectations are, then they'll be less likely to fear a performance evaluation. So the next step then is to put together a system of performance evaluations. People usually don't like performance evaluation. Employees don't like it because of the problem known as cognitive dissonance. So most employees feel they're doing a very good job. Then they get their performance evaluation and it's not as glowing as they thought it would be. That creates this cognitive dissonance and it leads them to try and shy away from having to have their performance evaluated. Supervisors don't like to do performance evaluations either because the associated results of that evaluation can be very important to the employee. So if someone gets a negative evaluation, it may be that they are no longer eligible for a promotion or they're no longer eligible to go to this training academy. And so supervisors kind of have this fear of playing God, and they don't want to have those major impacts upon the life and the career of their employees. So you have reticence on the part of both the employee as well as the evaluator. You're going to have a lot of agencies that kind of try and shy away from performance evaluation. But performance evaluation really is the keystone of the entire human resource management process. And there's a very famous article several years ago by an author named Charles Fox. And he referred to the title of his article as Performance Evaluation, the Keystone of the Human Resource Management Process. And by keystone, you think about an arch that's made up of these blocks. That block at the very top of the arch is called the keystone. You pull out that keystone, the entire arch collapses upon itself. You don't have a good performance evaluation process, the entire process will collapse. So it's important that we do a good job evaluating performance. And here we're evaluating the person's performance, not evaluating the content of the job. We did that evaluation of the content of the job back with job analysis and job evaluation. Here we're evaluating employee performance. I've listed on the screen there for you different performance evaluation methods. We're not going to go through all of them. The most common one, though, is graphic rating. We're probably all familiar with graphic rating. Graphic rating, you have these categories of excellent, good, fair, poor, and then the quality of the work produced by the employee is always excellent, good, fair, poor, and you select one of those graphics. That's a graphic rating type of approach. Nice thing about graphic rating, I'm sure we've all had a graphic rating type of performance evaluation. It is very quick. It is very easy. It gives us a quick summation of our performance. The problem is it doesn't give us formative feedback. And so if you got goods, you want to be excellent. It doesn't really give you an indication how to move from good to excellent. So we really need to combine that graphic rating with something else, such as an essay, where we can then provide that narrative formative feedback so that people know how to move from one level of evaluation to another. If you look at the bottom there, you see this thing called BARS. And BARS stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. Try and put that in text chat and talk. Behaviorally anchored rating scale. That's what's known as a BARS. That's kind of what we do academically when we have grading rubrics. And so in a behaviorally anchored rating scale, you may have, A, B, C, D, F as your grades, and then you'll have behaviors that are associated with each of those grades. So to get a grade of A on this essay, it must be a complete, comprehensive essay that is well written, that does not have grammatical errors, and that introduces a new way of looking at the issue. That's a behavior that will lead to an A. A B may be a complete comprehensive essay that is grammatically correct, that's devoid of typographical errors, but it reiterates existing knowledge and information. So you're not really creating something new, you're reiterating existing information. That's the behavior that will lead to a B, and then so on and so on. So we link the behavior with the summative rating. That allows us to show both a summation as well as a formative feedback approach for our employees. Now, it takes a lot more time and it takes a lot more effort to do a bars approach, but that bars approach is becoming much more common, not only in the academic world, but also in the world of public administration. Evaluations are important because without good performance evaluations, we're not going to be able to do our fourth function, which is discipline and sanctioning. So if you evaluate the performance of an employee and you find that employee's performance is deficient in some manner, you need to then provide training and opportunity. So you'll put together a targeted training type of opportunity for that individual to try and remediate that poor performance. Then after they've attended that training, you then assess their performance again, maybe in 3 or 6 months. If the performance is still deficient, then you have to provide them with more training and development opportunities, reassess their performance. If it's still deficient, you're probably going to provide them with more training and development opportunities. You can kind of see how it goes. We're career civil servants. We cannot just do a one and done. We can't just say, well, here's your performance evaluation. It was subpar, and so therefore you're out the door. We have to provide these professional development types of opportunities, these training opportunities, in order to afford them the opportunity to enhance their performance and then reassess their performance multiple times. All of this performance evaluation and documentation of training, all this documentation is necessary before we will be able to engage in disciplining and sanctioning and eventually perhaps termination. It is a misnomer whenever people say you cannot terminate a career civil servant. That's not true. Career civil servants can be terminated, but they have to be terminated based upon their performance. And so you're going to have these career service, civil service regulations that will require that you document all of this. And those documentation requirements will also be in that collective bargaining agreement. Collective bargaining agreements tend to be very specific when it comes to how you can discipline, sanction, and terminate an employee. Those articles in the collective bargaining agreement on discipline and sanctioning and termination tend to be the lengthiest of all the articles in a collective bargaining agreement. So the moral of the story here is document, document, document. Because if you terminate someone or if you discipline and sanction them without proper documentation, then you're going to open yourself up to a grievance to the union and perhaps even an unfair labor practice claim for CalPERB. So you have to be very careful and make sure to document everything. But that's kind of a quick overview of the management of human resources, kind of what we do, the functions we go through, our career civil service system, and where that career civil service system came from. This is, again, just the very tip of the iceberg in our survey-oriented introductory course. You'll get a lot more specifics and put a lot more flesh on the bones when you get into your PPA 577 Human Resource Management course. Any questions or comments or needs for clarification on any of this information we have covered up to this period in time? Okay. If not, we are pushing 5:30. So if we could do about a 10-minute break, if that's okay, because we do have a lot more information to cover in the second half of class with the management of financial resources. Let's take a break until 5:35. We'll come back at 5:35, and then we'll talk about our very last topic for the course, which is the management of financial resources. So I'll see you back here at 5:35. Okay, we are back for the stretch run. So this is the last piece of information we cover in this course and the last piece of information that you need in order to do the final assessment. And that's our final function, which is the management of financial resources to, again, give you a little insight into what you'll then be doing later on when you take PPA 500, Public Budgeting and Finance. Now I'm going to try and restrain myself from talking a lot about public finance. For years, I taught the budgeting course and financial management. And so I do think budgets are extremely important in public administration, and sometimes we undervalue their importance. So when we think about a budget, when we think about a budget as a statement of dollars and cents, we think about a budget as it is a statement of what we are going to spend our money on in the next fiscal year and how much money we are going to spend on each one of those line items. That's very important information for us because it's prospective. It tells us this is what we are planning on spending our money on in the next fiscal year. But budgets really go beyond that because in the public sector, we are always dealing with infinite demands, and we're trying to meet those infinite demands with very finite, limited resources. Whenever you have infinite demands and you have finite resources, it means you're going to have to make trade-offs. You're going to have to make decisions. You're going to have to make priorities. So our budget really is more than a statement of dollars and cents. It really is a statement of societal priorities. So in a given budget, if we are spending more money on K through 12 education and we're spending less money on small business grants, then we see that our priority for that year is K through 12 education. There are these opportunity costs that are by definition involved in every budget because we can't fund everything. So by funding something, it means there's something else we are not able to fund. Once we conceptualize of a budget as a statement of societal priorities, we have now elevated its importance above and beyond just being a statement of dollars and cents. So I'd really encourage you as you move on to 555 to think about budgets from that perspective of being a true statement of societal priorities. Now, in the public sector, we tend to use two different types of budgets. We use operating budgets and we use capital budgets. We're going to focus primarily tonight on operating budgets. We'll do a little on capital budgets, but primarily operating budgets. Operating budgets are the budgets for the money that we are using for the day-to-day functioning of our organization. So paying salary, paying benefits, paying for supplies, paying for utilities, paying for maintenance, that's going to come out of this operating budget. Then for our high price tag, long lifespan, non-recurring items, such as a new city hall, renovations to a recreation center, a fleet of police vehicles. Those types of expenditures are what we call capital expenditures, and those are then within a separate type of budget known as a capital budget. It is important for state and local governments to maintain a separate capital budget because those capital projects are so expensive that if we would dump them into our operating budget, it would be impossible for us to balance our revenues and expenditures. It would really blow a hole in our operating budget. Think about a $100 million building being thrown into a $200 million operating budget. It's 50% of the entire budget. So we segregate those projects, those capital projects, into a separate capital budget. Also, by segregating them into a separate capital budget, we can be more rational in our decision making. And we talked about those four different decision making models, and we say that rationality is sometimes difficult to do just because it's so time and resource intensive. But at least if we can think about these capital projects differently in a separate capital budget, we can be much more rational in making our decisions. And you want to be as rational as you can because a $50 to $100 million building is certainly a big issue. And it's something you want to be as rational as you can possibly be. So how do we construct budgets in the public sector? Regardless of whether you're talking about the national, state, or local level, there are basically four main phases in the budgeting process. There's preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation. And to illustrate what happens in each of these four phases of the budgeting process, I think it's probably best for us to look at the federal level. Now, I know most of us don't work at the federal level, but even as local government employees, we are still impacted by federal funds, by federal grants and aid. And so we still are being impacted by the federal budget. Also, most state and local governments will kind of mirror and build their budget processes off of what goes on at the federal level. Now, you can teach an entire course and even have an entire degree program focused only on the federal budget process. It is that complicated, it is that complex. There are members of Congress who have served in Congress for 30 years who will admit that they still don't know every in and out of the federal budgeting process because it is that complex of a process. But just for our limited purposes here, let's kind of talk through what happens in each of these four phases at the federal level. So your first phase is preparation. Before we can decide how much money we are spending in the next fiscal year, we must first know how much money we are going to generate, how much revenue we're going to generate. So in preparation, we do these revenue forecasts. And so we'll use various types of models to forecast the amount of revenue we anticipate to generate in the next fiscal year. We also have to have an idea of how much it will cost us to continue our current level of services in the next fiscal year, accounting for inflation. You know, inflation's really been a buzz term lately in our country, but we every year we do have an increase in the cost of living adjustment, cost of doing business factor. And so what you were able to provide in terms of services last year, that same level of services will probably cost you a little bit more this year because of inflationary factors. So what happens in preparation is we have two main organizations. We have the Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as the OMB, and the OMB serves the president. And the OMB will put together a revenue forecast and will put together expenditure estimates for the president. Then the second organization we have is the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. And the Congressional Budget Office does the same types of things, but will do those types of things in the service of Congress. So we have one organization that serves Congress, we have one organization that serves the president. So they'll put together these revenue forecasts and these expenditure estimates. As they put together these revenue forecasts and these expenditure estimates, the two organizations use somewhat different methodologies. So they'll use different discounting rates and they'll have different methods that they use, which oftentimes will lead to different results. The Office of Management and Budget, their revenue forecasts tend to be much more optimistic than the revenue forecasts we get from the Congressional Budget Office. And the reason for that is that the Office of Management and Budget has an audience of one. Its audience is the president. Congressional Budget Office has an audience of 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate. So it tends to be a little bit more realistic in terms of its revenue forecasts. But those organizations will put together revenue forecasts and expenditure estimates. And then the Office of Management and Budget, based upon those estimates, will then put out a call for agency budgets. It used to be what was known as Circular A-22. And they would ask these individual agencies and departments, give us your budget request for the next fiscal year. Agencies and departments will then submit their budget requests. OMB will review those budget requests, will probably slash those budget requests, and those revised, reduced budget requests will then be cobbled together into the executive budget, into the president's budget. All of this happens in preparation, beginning usually about a year or a year and a half before the fiscal year actually begins. So we're doing this well in advance of the beginning of the new fiscal year. Once the president's budget, the executive budget, is constructed, we'll have a State of the Union address that usually occurs near the end of January. Now, there's some flexibility there. As we know from our reading of the Constitution just says in Article 2 that the president will update Congress from time to time on the State of the Union. It doesn't say how often, it doesn't say in what format. That's all very ambiguous. The way in which practice has emerged is that usually there'll be a call, an invitation will come from the Speaker of the House, will be sent to the White House, inviting the president to come before a joint session of Congress, usually in late January, to then give a State of the Union address. That State of the Union address is usually modeled after a lot of the priorities that are embodied within the president's budget. Then after the State of the Union address is when the president will then release their budget to Congress. When the president's budget is released to Congress, we transition from the preparation phase into our second phase, which is formulation. Once Congress gets the president's budget, they are then in the formulation phase, and this usually is early February and will run, at least technically, supposed to run through the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. When the president's budget goes to Congress, it initially goes to the budget committees. And there's a budget committee in the House and there's a budget committee in the Senate. The House and the Senate budget committees have the responsibility of passing what's known as the concurrent resolution on the budget. That concurrent resolution on the budget will establish the maximum allowable spending levels across all of our programmatic areas. So here's the maximum amount that we can spend on health and human services. Here's the maximum amount that can be spent on agriculture, and so on and so on. The purpose of this concurrent resolution on the budget is to impose some spending discipline on Congress. Now, it's very much up for debate whether or not that actually happens. Congress still overspends, but it's at least supposed to put some spending limits on how much money can be spent by Congress. Then in formulation, the next step in the process in formulation is the appropriations committees. Now, this takes a little explanation. There are two types of spending in the federal level. There's discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So Congress says, we don't want to spend this much money on program A, so we're going to cut its appropriations. That's discretionary. They can do that directly. That type of discretionary spending goes through what's called the appropriations process. And we have an appropriations committee in the House and an appropriations committee in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will then have 12 separate subcommittees. Each of those 12 subcommittees will work on the appropriation bill in their programmatic area. So the Agriculture Appropriation Subcommittee will work on the Agriculture Appropriation Bill, Health and Human Services on the Health and Human Services Bill, and so on and so on. Those 12 appropriations subcommittees will then hold hearings and do markups and make amendments to the appropriation bill, and then pass their appropriation bills back up to the parent appropriations committee. The parent appropriations committee, when they receive these bills, will then hold markups, hold hearings, make amendments, and then pass that appropriation bill. There are 12 separate appropriation bills that make up the bulk of discretionary spending in the federal budget. So the House is doing that at the same time the Senate is doing the same type of work. The problem is that the appropriation bills that come out of the House often look different than the appropriation bills that come out of the Senate. We know again from our reading of the Constitution in Article 1 that any bills that come out of the House and Senate must come out in identical format before they can go to the president for the president's signature. So then we have to have conference committees to try and hammer out those differences between the House version of the appropriation bill and the Senate version of the appropriation bill. So that's the appropriations process. And that's for discretionary spending. Then the second type of spending we have is mandatory. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over. So things such as interest on the national debt. Whenever Congress borrows money, it enters into a legal obligation to repay that money, to repay principal and interest. It doesn't have a choice to not repay that debt. So Congress doesn't have direct control over interest on the debt. Entitlement programs. With entitlement programs, people are legally entitled to the benefits, and so therefore, if they meet the eligibility requirements, they get the benefits. If Congress wants to reduce the spending on entitlement programs, they have to go through an authorizations process. Authorizations committee would then have to change eligibility requirements. So mandatory spending goes through authorization committees. Discretionary spending goes through appropriations committees. If everything works the way in which it's supposed to work, and spoiler alert, it doesn't, but if it works the way in which it's supposed to work, by September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, all 12 appropriation bills have been passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the president in preparation for the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. Federal government's fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. Here in the state of California, our fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. So we're on a different fiscal year, a different calendar than the federal level. But all 12 of these appropriation bills are supposed to be passed, signed by the president, and then we can start spending the money beginning the new fiscal year on October 1st. When all those appropriation bills are signed and we enter into the new fiscal year on October 1st, we then transition from formulation into the third phase, which is execution. And this is where we actually go out there and spend the money. Now, this is where we have problems in that typically we do not get all 12 appropriation bills passed by Congress and signed by the president by the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. That just simply does not happen. We may get 3 or 4 of them, or maybe 5 or 6 of them passed, but there'll still be unpassed appropriation bills when the new fiscal year begins. If an appropriation bill has not been passed and signed by the president, then the agencies within that programmatic area do not have legal authority to spend money as of October 1st. So to keep those agencies operating, Congress will pass what they call continuing resolutions. And a continuing resolution will say, we will fund the Department of Agriculture at 80% of what it received for these 2 weeks last year. So we'll reduce what you're getting, but we'll give you 80% of what you got for those 2 weeks last year to buy ourselves 2 weeks in order to come to agreement on the agriculture appropriation bill. If they still can't come to agreement in 2 weeks, they'll pass another continuing resolution, maybe for 4 weeks, to buy themselves some more time. When they still haven't come to an agreement and that continuing resolution expires, they'll pass another continuing resolution and kind of so on throughout the fall. Now, eventually, Congress will get to the point, and the president will get to the point where they are no longer going to abide having these continuing resolutions. Push comes to shove, and we've got to get a permanent budget in place. When that happens, then you have 2 options. One option is a partial government shutdown. So for all of those areas in the federal bureaucracy where their appropriation bills have not yet been passed, they then lack the authority to spend any money, and so therefore they will shut down their operations. And I think we had made a mention to how this worked with the Department of Treasury and the IRS back in the Trump administration, and what had happened in that regard. But you have this partial government shutdown. That's one option. The second option is that you take all these unpassed appropriation bills and you cobble them all together into this mammoth, ugly piece of legislation known as an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And I'll put that in text chat. An Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as an OBRA. Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. That's a lot I misspelled reconciliation because I was typing quickly. I apologize. But Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as an OBRA and OBRA. As we put all of these unpassed appropriation bills together into this massive Omnibus Act, in order to get members to vote yes on this, we have to give them something. And so maybe you have a member from West Virginia who wants to have a bridge built in their district and have their name on that bridge. Well, we'll go ahead and put that in the OBRA because that will then get you to vote for it. Maybe a member from upstate New York wants to have a recreation center built. Well, we'll put that project in there as well. And we just dump all of these different projects and all the spending into this OBRA just to get enough people to sign, to pass it, to get signed by the president so we can reopen the government and operate. It leads to a lot of overspending, and you hear a lot about pork barrel spending. Well, this is a great example of pork barrel spending. Members bringing home the bacon, members getting all the spending for their districts shoved into this Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. It's no way to do a federal budget, but it is the way that every year we tend to do the federal budget is through the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. So I think you can certainly say that the federal budget process is broken because we are not able to get all 12 appropriation bills passed before the beginning of the new fiscal year. Then once we have a budget in place one way or another, from October 1st to September 30th, we are in the current fiscal year. We are going out there and spending the money. We're implementing the spending in the budget. When that fiscal year ends, we then shift from execution to evaluation. Then we evaluate how we spent the money. We will audit the books. We'll look at, did the money get spent in the way in which it was legally authorized to be spent? Those are financial and legal audits. We'll ask the question, how well did we spend the money? How well did the spending of this money help us accomplish our goals and objectives? Those are performance and management-based audits. So we'll basically audit the books then in the evaluation phase. Those are the four basic phases of the federal budget process. It is so complicated because we have an overlapping of phases between fiscal years. So when you are in the evaluation process for one fiscal year, you are in the execution phase of another fiscal year, and in the formulation phase for another fiscal year, and in the preparation phase for another fiscal year. So you have 4 fiscal years that are all overlapping on top of each other in different phases of the budgeting process. Now, that's how budgets are done at the federal level. Here in California, it's a little bit different. Here in California, we do not have these separate appropriation bills. We have a budget bill. That budget bill is put together by the Department of Finance and the governor's office. That's done in January. The Department of Finance is kind of the corollary to the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level. The corollary to the Congressional Budget Office down here in California is the Legislative Analyst Office, otherwise known as the LAO. And you'll see some, well, if you look at your ballot, you'll see all these propositions on your ballot, and then there'll be a fiscal impact analysis for those propositions. That fiscal impact analysis is usually done by the Legislative Analyst Office by the LAO. But the Department of Finance serves the governor, the LAO, I guess you can say kind of technically serves the state legislature, but really does a whole lot more than what we see done by the CBO at the federal level. So the budget's put together by the Department of Finance and the governor in January and then goes to the state legislature. Now, here in California, not a lot happens with that budget document until we have this thing in May known as the May revise. This is kind of a unique thing that we do here in California that a lot of other states don't do. So when that initial budget was put together in January, it was created based upon assumptions in terms of the amount of revenue that we are going to generate. Sometimes we don't generate the amount of revenue that we thought we would. Our revenue, actual revenue, is lagging behind our forecasted revenue. So in the May revise, we take into account what we have generated in revenue, and then we make changes to the budget. The governor's office will make changes to the executive budget. So we saw that this year in the May revise, we were lagging behind in terms of the collection of tax revenue. So we didn't have as much revenue in May as we thought we were going to have back in January. That led to some pretty significant cuts to the budget as a result of this May revise. Once this May revise is done, then the state legislature will start working on this May revise to then pass the budget out supposedly by June 15th. And so the deadline is the state legislature will finish its business of formulation by June 15th, pass that budget. That budget then gets signed by the governor no later than June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. However, just because the fiscal year begins on July 1st does not mean that local agencies are comfortable going out there and spending money immediately. Here in California, we have a process known as trailer bills. So even after the budget is passed, there are still a lot of details to be worked out in terms of how this money should be spent. And so eligibility requirements for the recipients of this money. All those details need to be worked out with these trailer bills that will be passed by the state legislature after they've passed the budget. So in late June and July, and as long as they're in session in the summer, they'll be passing out these trailer bills. Oftentimes, local agencies will wait until they see the trailer bills so they know exactly how they are allowed to spend the money before they go out there and start spending the money. So a little bit of a different process here in California, but it's still the same preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation phases that we see used up at the federal level. So that's kind of how public budgets are created. The next question is, what do public budgets look like? And budgets can differ in terms of their appearance based upon what you are trying to achieve with those budgets. And there was a very famous article several years ago by somebody named Schick, Alan Schick. And Schick said that there are three basic purposes you can use a public budget for. You can use the public budget for control, you can use it for management, or you can use it as a planning document to help strategically plan the operations of your organization. And what you want to use your budget for will then dictate what type of budget format you want to use. So the traditional type of budget format that we are probably all familiar with is a line item budget. And I provided examples of these budget formats on our Canvas site. We're not going to go through them here for the sake of time. You'll go through all these and examples of them when you take 555. But a line item budget is a traditional, very simple budget. Here's what we're spending the money on. Here's the object of expenditure. And here's the amount that we're spending on that object. So salaries, X amount of dollars. Benefits, X amount of dollars. Supplies, X amount of dollars. Very simple line item budget. Each expenditure is on a different line item of the spreadsheet. Nice thing about line item budget, it is very simple to do. It's very quick and easy to do. And it allows you to control the amount of money you're spending and what you're spending that money on. So if you want to control your spending, a line item budget may help you control your spending. The disadvantage of a line item budget is it doesn't give you any information except for how much you're spending and what you're spending that money on. So when you create your line item budget, you look at last year's line item budget. How much did we spend on supplies last year? Then we'll add on 2 or 3% for inflationary increases, and that's what we'll spend on supplies in this next fiscal year. So it doesn't give you a lot of feedback in terms of how well you're spending the money. It tells you what you're spending money on, how much you're spending, but not how well you're spending the money and how the spending of this money is helping you accomplish your organizational and programmatic goals. So because of those limitations with the line item budget, a second budget format that we see local governments using is what's called a performance-based budget. In a performance-based budget, we are going to incorporate performance expectations, performance metrics. So if we are going to spend money, additional money on street patrols for our police department, then those street patrols, the activities will be the number of hours spent on those street patrols. And here's the amount of money that's spent on the number of hours. Well, what are the performance expectations? If we're spending this additional money on street patrols, we would anticipate that there would be a reduction in violent and non-violent crime rates because we have more police presence in the streets. So we're going to measure how those crime rates have declined after we have spent this additional money. That's a performance measurement. That's a performance indicator. By incorporating performance indicators into our budget, we are then transforming the budget into a management tool that allows us to better manage our operations. So if we want to use the budget as a management tool, you'll want to use a performance-based type of budget. And honestly, at local government level, they oftentimes combine line item with performance. So the first part of the local budget will be simple line item. Then the second part will then get into some of those performance metrics and how well we are achieving those performance metrics. So that's what's called performance-based budgeting. It is most popular at the local level of government. Then the third type of budget format is what's called a program-based budget. Now, with a line item budget and a performance-based budget, they are both oriented around division and department. So you'll have a police department budget. You'll have a fire department budget. You'll have a Department of Emergency Preparedness budget. But each department will have its own budget in line item and performance-based. However, in program-based, you do not budget according to the department, but you budget according to the program. So you may have a program such as protection of persons and property. Protection of persons and property is a responsibility of the police department, but it's also a responsibility of the fire department. It's also a responsibility of the Department of Emergency Preparedness. So the activities in the police department, the activities in the fire department, the activities in the emergency preparedness department that contribute to the protection of persons and property will all be budgeted together under protection of persons and property under that program, irrespective of which department's carrying out those activities. So your program budget is going to look a lot different than a line item of performance in that it won't be broken down by department, but rather it'll be organized according to program. That's called a program-based budget. That helps you with the planning feature. That allows you to better strategically plan the operations of your organization to see how all the things you are doing as an organization contribute to the achievement of these different programmatic goals. One of the common strategies that gets used in programmatic budgeting is what's known as crosswalking. And in crosswalking, what we will do is we'll create a matrix. Along the top of the matrix, we will array the different program goals that we are trying to achieve. Then along the left side, we will array all the different activities that we are engaging in. And then for whatever activity that activity fosters, whichever programmatic goal, you put an X in that cell, and so on and so on. And that allows you to see which activities fall under which programs and can then be budgeted together in that programmatic type of an approach. So it's a really nice strategic planning tool for your organization. The fourth type of budget format is a zero-based budget. And this is less a format as it is a process. So as you go through zero-based budgeting process, that process can actually result in the creation of a line item budget. It could result in the creation of a performance budget. So in a zero-based budget, what you are doing is a bottom-up budgeting process, whereby you look at your organization and you identify the lowest level in your organization where budget decisions can be made. That lowest level where budget decisions can be made, that's called a decision unit. So you may have multiple decision units within your organization. Each of those decision units will come up with a series of what are called decision packages, different alternatives for spending, and then the consequences of those alternatives. So one decision package may say, we're going to fund this program at 110% of what it was funded at last year. Well, the consequence of that 10% increase means that we're going to be able to reach out to more people, we'll be able to serve more eligible households. Those are the consequences of spending an additional 10%. Another alternative might be funded at 90% of what it was funded at last year, a 10% cut. Well, that 10% cut means we're going to be able to serve X number of fewer families, X number of fewer households. Those are the consequences. So we know all the consequences of all these different alternatives, alternative funding levels. All those decision packages then get ranked and prioritized down at the decision unit level, get sent up the organization chart to, say, middle level management, who will re-rank and reprioritize those packages. And those packages then get sent up to the top level, which will get re-ranked and reprioritized. The highest ranked packages then get to become part of the budget. So the high ranked packages then become part of our agency's budget. A very decentralized bottom-up type of an approach. The problem with zero-based budgeting is very time-consuming and very expensive. Say, for instance, you have 10 different decision units in your organization. Each of those decision units will put together 10 different decision packages. If you have 10 units putting together 10 packages each, you've got 100 different decision packages that have to be analyzed, ranked, and prioritized at different levels of your organization. So you can see sometimes how the lack of feasibility in terms of you have limited resources, your ability to use zero-based budgeting. That's why when governments use zero-based budgeting, they usually do a modified approach, whereby they'll say, we'll take 80% of the budget and we'll do it like a regular line item. So we'll just take 80% of the budget as assumed. But for that remaining 20%, we'll subject it to a zero-based budgeting process. Then next year, we'll subject a different 20%. The next year, a different 20%, and so on, so that every 5 years, at least 20% of your budget will have been gone through a zero-based budgeting process. So after 5 years, the entire budget, as a one time or another, gone through zero-based budgeting. It's just a little bit more realistic way of using zero-based budgeting. Program-based budgeting and zero-based budgeting are both very rational ways of looking at how we are spending our money. Line item budgeting is a very incremental type of decision-making budget, very incremental marginal changes from one year to the next. Performance-based budgeting is kind of in between. There's more rationality there because we are looking at performance metrics, but not quite as rational as what we would get with performance for a program or zero-based budgets. But as you get into 555, you're going to get into what these different budget formats look like and more into their advantages and disadvantages. But if you're interested, again, I'll put those links up on our Canvas site so you can see some examples of those 4 different budget formats. So up to this point in time, we've talked about how budgets are constructed. We've talked about what budgets look like, but we have focused primarily on the expenditure side of the equation. We know commonsensically that in order to spend money, we must first have that money. We must raise revenue in order to then make expenditures. So let's talk for a couple minutes about the type of revenue that public agencies rely upon in making their expenditures. So we know that governments rely on both tax-based as well as non-tax sources of revenue. The tax-based sources of revenue, the big 3, as we all know, property, income, and sales taxes. Property taxes are wealth-based taxes. They're considered to be what we call an ability to pay tax. You pay tax based upon your ability to pay that tax. Your ability to pay is measured by the assessed value of your property. So if you have a higher assessed value, you pay more in property taxes than if you have a lower assessed value. As an ability to pay type of tax, the property tax can be regressive in nature, meaning that people, when they pay their property tax bill, they will pay it out of their liquid income. They're probably not going to refinance their home to pay their property taxes. So you could have a disconnect whereby you have a high valued home, but you recently lost your job, and so you have very low income. That type of disconnect would then make this what we call a very regressive form of tax, and that people who have less ability to pay are actually paying a lot in tax liability. So the property tax does have that tendency to be somewhat regressive. Here in California, we can't get into a lot of this because of our time limitations, but we have Proposition 13. And you'll talk a lot more about Proposition 13 once you get to 555. Essentially, Proposition 13, passed by the voters in 1978, limits the amount of property tax revenue that local governments can generate. There's a 1% tax rate limitation and a 2% limitation on the assessed value of a taxpayer's home. Combine those two things together, and it means that there's a limited amount of property tax revenue local governments can generate. Because of that, we have seen local governments move away from the property tax and move to other tax sources, as well as moving to other sources that are not based upon taxation. So there's been a pronounced shift in California away from a reliance upon property taxes at the local level. But historically, the property tax was the primary source of revenue for local governments. Income taxes, we are all familiar with. There are income taxes at the national level. We have an income tax here in the state of California. We do not have the types of local income taxes that you see in a lot of other states. The income tax is also an ability to pay type of tax in that your ability to pay is measured by your adjusted gross income, your AGI. There are circuit breakers that are meant to lower your tax liability, things such as deductions. So you can take a standard deduction or you can itemize your deductions. Usually, if people own a home, they're probably much more likely to itemize their deductions because you can deduct the interest that you've paid on your mortgage in the past year, which oftentimes outweighs the value of the standard deduction. In the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, the value of the standard deduction was greatly increased to try and induce more people to take the standard deduction. More people take the standard deduction, the easier it is to file taxes, and the easier it is on taxpayers, as well as the easier it is on the IRS in terms of auditing those tax returns. People tend to like the income tax more than the property tax because it's seen as a fairer tax. Because you have these deductions, you also have tax credits. Tax credits are credits that are subtracted directly off your tax liability. So if you have a dependent child credit, and you have a dependent child credit of $1,500, and your tax bill is $5,000. You subtract $1,500 directly from the $5,000, lowers your liability to $3,500. Tax credits are very powerful tools to lower tax liability. Also, we have a marginal graduated income tax system, both at the national as well as at the state level, meaning that you only pay taxation at a certain percent for each portion of your income. So up to a certain amount of your income, you pay it at 10%. Then above that, up to a certain amount, 15%. Above that to a certain amount, 20%, and so on and so on. So if you're in the 33% tax bracket, you do not pay 33% on your entire income, only that top portion of your income. And then finally, we have sales taxes. Sales taxes are obviously different because they are consumption-based taxes. They are not an ability to pay tax, they are a benefits received tax. So you pay the taxation based upon the benefit that you're receiving from consuming some type of commodity that you purchased. So you buy a candy bar, you eat that candy bar, you're obtaining a benefit from consuming that candy bar. If you choose not to buy the candy bar, then you don't have to pay the tax. Sales taxes allow people to shift the burden onto other individuals, especially with a certain type of sales tax known as a selective excise tax. Selective excise taxes will apply taxation differently depending upon the commodity that's being transacted. So you think about something like a sin tax, a tobacco tax. If you don't use tobacco products, you don't have to pay that tobacco tax. So you can shift the burden onto people who do use tobacco products. The more people can shift the burden of taxation onto others, the more likely they are to support that type of tax. The main problem with the sales tax is that the sales tax can be highly regressive in that it doesn't take into account someone's ability to pay in terms of what they are paying. Instead, it bases the tax rate on what you are purchasing. So if you don't have commodity exemptions, if you don't exempt things, staples of life, such as food and such as pharmaceutical medications, then it can become a very regressive, very unfair type of tax. We know we have sales taxes at the state level. We also have local option sales taxes. We don't currently have a true sales tax at the national level, but every session of Congress, there is another bill that's proposed to institute a national sales tax. So we'll have to see where that goes in the future. But because of some of the limitations on the property tax, we have seen a lot of local governments move to non-tax sources of revenue, things like user charges and user fees. Now, admittedly, local governments will oftentimes use these terms interchangeably with each other, but they are different. A user charge is usually associated with the consumption of some type of a service. So you're getting some benefit from consuming a service. So you pay a user charge for the electricity that you are consuming. That's a user charge. It's based upon a service. User fees are usually not based upon consumption of a service, but rather they're based upon the privilege of engaging in a certain type of behavior. So if you want to drive a car, you have to get a driver's license and you have to pay a driver's license fee. You want to drive your car on the road, you have to register your car and pay a registration fee. You want to hunt, you have to get a hunting license and pay a fee for that hunting license. It allows government to collect money through these fees. It also then allows government to control how people behave in these types of activities. So if you violate hunting laws, you can have your hunting license revoked. You violate driving laws, you can have your driver's license suspended and or revoked. So we've seen much more of a usage of user charges and user fees of late in cities in California, especially after the passage of Proposition 13 in 1978. Now, the caveat there is that even though the average city in California gets more revenue from non-tax sources of revenue than the property tax, here in Southern California, most of our cities are still pretty heavily reliant upon the property tax. And so if you go and you look at your own city, you may see that your city gets a plurality of its revenue from the property tax, which is different than the average city in California. So those are revenues. We've already talked about expenditures. Now the question is, what happens when our revenues are not enough to cover our expenditures? What happens when we have an imbalance between revenues and expenditures? That's what we refer to as a deficit. A deficit is an imbalance in revenues and expenditures in one given fiscal year. We have run deficits at the federal level every single fiscal year from 1969 until today, with the exception of 2 years, in 1999 and 2000. In 99 and 2000, we actually had on paper a surplus where our revenues exceeded our expenditures. Other than that, we always run a deficit. When you are running deficits year after year after year, those deficits will accumulate into your long-term debt. So the national debt increases because of these annual deficits. Debt is different than a deficit in that a deficit's an imbalance between revenues and expenditures in one fiscal year. Debt tends to be much more long-term. So a debt is something such as a bond. So whenever governments need to borrow money to build a new building, they will issue what's called a bond. A bond is long-term debt, and it's debt that matures in more than 1 year. So whenever we're going to build a $50 million building, we're probably not going to have $50 million sitting in an account somewhere. So to get started on that building, we'll borrow that money. We'll issue a bond. There are three main types of bonds that we oftentimes see cities using: general obligation, revenue bonds, and double barrel bonds. A general obligation bond is called general obligation because when the government borrows this money, it guarantees to investors that it will use its full faith and credit to repay the debt. In other words, it tells investors, we will do anything that we need to do in order to generate the revenue to repay this debt. If it means we have to lay off an employee, we'll do that. If it means that we have to sell physical assets, we will do that. So with general obligation bonds, investors, when they purchase these bonds, they know that they're going to get their money back. It's a very safe, secure investment. Well, if you do any investing, you know that there is this relationship between risk and reward. The higher the risk, the more reward the investor expects. The lower the risk, the less the reward expected by the investor. General obligation bonds have very low risk because the investor knows the government will do anything it needs to repay the debt. So these general obligation bonds tend to be very cost effective for local governments. You can get very low interest rates when you borrow money through issuing these general obligation bonds. The downside of a general obligation bond is, number one, you are pledging your full faith and credit. So you're really on the hook for repaying this debt. The second problem is that typically you need a higher threshold of voter approval to be able to pass a general obligation bond. Typically, you need to get 2/3 voter approval to pass a general obligation bond in California. Now, there is a proposition on the ballot next month, and that proposition will call for making bonds that are used to build affordable housing to make them subject to only a 55% voter approval instead of a 2/3 voter approval. We did a similar thing with school district bonds not long ago, in that if a school district issues a general obligation bond, that bond only needs to get 55% voter approval instead of a 2/3 voter approval. Now, if you're going to use that type of a bond, you have to set up a citizen oversight committee that will do regular audits. And so there are some stipulations attached to it, but it makes it much easier to pass those general obligation bonds. A second type of bond is what's called a revenue bond. Revenue bonds, the repayment of those bonds will be secured from the revenue that's generated from the operation of a facility. So say you're going to construct a recreation center. That recreation center will then charge people a fee to use the recreation center. You can then collect those fees and use that revenue from those fees to repay the debt. So the debt is being repaid from this special revenue source from the operation of the recreation center. What that means for a revenue bond is that revenue bonds are much riskier investments for the investors. They don't have this full faith and credit guarantee. If the recreation center goes belly up and is not fiscally viable, then they're not going to get their money repaid. So since there's a higher risk associated with revenue bonds, investors expect a higher return. So the interest rates charged with revenue bonds will be much higher than what you will be able to charge with a general obligation bond. So it'd be much more costly for a government to issue a revenue bond. Then the third type is a double barrel. In a double barrel, we combine the two together. So part of the issue will be general obligation, part of the debt issue will be revenue. So if you're in a situation where you're constructing this recreation center and you know it will generate revenue for you, but the revenue is not enough to completely repay the debt, it'll only repay part of the debt, then that part of the debt will be revenue and the rest of the debt will be secured with general obligation securities. So you combine general obligation revenue together into what's called a double barrel bond. There are a lot of other types of bonds you'll learn about in public budgeting, things like capital appreciation bonds, zero coupon bonds, lease rental bonds, sale leaseback bonds, all kinds of different permutations of bonds that governments have devised in order to give them a little bit more flexibility in how they can borrow money. But for our purposes and for the purposes of the final exam, those are the three different bonds that we are looking at in this class: general obligation, revenue, and double barrel. But these are for bonds. These are long-term debt, long-term borrowing of money, more than 1 year in maturity. Sometimes governments will borrow money much shorter in maturity, less than 1 year in maturity. That short-term debt is usually referred to as a note. So say, for instance, you want to get started on this building that you're constructing. And so you go out there and you're issuing a bond, but the bond proceeds have not come in yet, but you want to get started on construction. You might issue what's called a bond anticipation note. It's a short-term note in which you will borrow the money, and that note will then be secured by the bond proceeds that you may be receiving in 2 or 3 or 4 months. So it's a very short-term borrowing of money referred to as notes. Long-term borrowing of money tends to be referred to as bonds. Not all debt is bad. If you are borrowing money to build necessary capital projects and to enhance your physical facilities and your physical plant, that is a good use of borrowing money. If, however, you are borrowing money to try and cover an imbalance between revenues and expenditures, that's a bad use of debt because obviously that's not the way in which you're going to want to run your budgets. So there's good debt and there's also bad debt. So just kind of wrap all of this up. We've talked about the budgeting process in the public sector. We've talked about different types of budgets. We've talked about revenues and expenditures. We've talked about borrowing money. What we do know is that at least at the national level, the budgeting process is out of control. The budgeting process, we're not getting budgets done on time. We haven't gotten budgets done on time in the past 50 years, and we run deficits every single year with the exception of two. So the budgeting process is just not working for us, despite the fact that we've tried to reform it multiple times in our history. Just three quick examples of ways in which we've tried to fix public budgeting. The first one is called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. This was passed in 1974. The focus of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was to try and get budgets done on time. And the way in which we did it is we created a House and Senate Budget Committee. We set up this budget resolution process to impose some spending discipline. We changed the fiscal year to run from October 1st until September 30th. We did all these different things to try and change the process to make the process work. Despite the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, we still every year struggle to get the budget done on time. And it's really very rare if we have a year where we actually follow the budget process and the budget process works. So then 10 years later in the 1980s, we thought, well, let's try and focus on deficits and see if we can just get control and eliminate these deficits. So we had this thing called Graham-Rudman-Hollings, and there were two of these acts, one in 1985, one in 1987. The three gentlemen on the screen, those are Graham, Rudman, and Hollings. So you have a Republican, you have an independent, and you have a Democrat. So it's a bipartisan piece of legislation. And what they tried to do in Graham-Rudman-Hollings is to establish these maximum allowable deficits. So the maximum deficit that we would tolerate each year. And then they set up a timetable so those maximum allowable deficit targets would decrease each year until finally we would get to a zero deficit target. It didn't work. Didn't work because number one, it was unconstitutional. We won't get into that tonight. But number two, it didn't work because Congress could always go back and change those deficit targets. So if we're going to miss a deficit target, we'll just go back and increase it and then revise our timetable upwards. And then next year we'll do the same thing, and next year we'll do the same thing. And deficits, instead of going down to zero, actually continued to increase throughout the 80s and the 90s. So it didn't work. So we try again 10 years later, or really it's about 5 years later, in the Budget Enforcement Act in 1990. The idea behind the Budget Enforcement Act is, instead of focusing on process, like we did in the 1970s, instead of focusing on deficits like we did in the 1980s, let's focus on the root of the problem, which is runaway spending. So they want to focus on trying to reduce spending in the Budget Enforcement Act. So the way they did it is they set up three different categories of spending: domestic, defense, and international. And then they put firewalls between those three categories. So if you wanted to spend more money on a domestic program, you would have to pay for it by reducing spending in another domestic program, but you had to stay within that domestic spending category. You couldn't spend more on defense by taking money from domestic or vice versa. And then the second thing it did is it introduced this idea known as pay as you go. And pay as you go went by the acronym known as PAYGO. So if you wanted to create a new program, that's all well and good, but you got to pay for it. And you can't pay for it by borrowing money. So if you want to create a new program, you have to pay for it by eliminating another program, or at least reducing spending enough in another program to pay for this new program. So all new spending must be paid for as you go. Now, this met with a little bit more success. And this, coupled with a quickly growing economy in the 1990s, you think about the dot-com boom, and you had the internet exploding, and you had the Silicon Valley and all these companies that were raking in hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars in profits. That was putting a lot of money into federal income tax coffers. So you had all this federal revenue coming in. You had these kind of modest limitations on spending. You combine those two things together, and in 1999 and 2000, we actually were able to at least technically avoid deficits and go into surplus spending. Then we all know what happened in 2001. We had the events of September 11th, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, an explosion in the amount of spending that we were doing, and a reduction in revenue. And that then led us right back into deficit spending. And we have been in deficit spending ever since. So I think the moral of the story here is that you can reform the process all that you want. But if there is not the political willpower in Congress and with the president to cut spending and or increase revenue, you're never going to be able to eliminate deficits. You're never going to be able to get the process under control. And what has really compounded the problems of getting the budget done on time is this polarization that we have seen in Congress. And not to make this a little too political sciencey, but this polarization in Congress is kind of the result of partisan gerrymandering. And so as we continue to gerrymander these congressional districts, we continue to make safe Republican districts and safe Democratic districts. The members, the representatives from those safe Republican and safe Democratic districts, they don't have to worry about a general election, because in a safe Republican district, there's no way a Democrat's going to win that seat. In a safe Democratic district, there's no way a Republican will win that seat. So they can completely discount the general election. What they have to focus on is the primary election within their own party. And when they focus on the primary election, the types of voters who vote in primary elections tend to be much more ideologically extreme than your mainstream general election voter. So you have to start appealing to the extreme ideological end of your party. So Republicans will start making decisions that are more in line with conservative ideology. Democrats will make their decisions more in line with liberal ideologies. And you have this hollowing out of the middle ground. That hollowing out of the middle ground means that you don't have any members left to negotiate compromises in the budget. And that's why it becomes next to impossible for us to get the budget done on time. So I really do think that it all boils down to politics, having the political willpower to make difficult decisions, and then coming up with some way to remedy the safe districts that have been created through this process of political gerrymandering. And again, that's kind of a pox on both houses. The Republicans do it when they're in power, the Democrats do it when they're in power as well. So in terms of the future of budgeting, I haven't painted a very happy future for budgeting. And I think what compounds this kind of negative view of the future of budgeting is the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen the COVID-19 pandemic that we thought would have major fiscal impacts upon the state of California. Those fiscal impacts didn't really materialize until much later because we had all that federal COVID money that was flowing in from Washington, D.C. Well, now that money's not flowing in anymore. Those grant programs have expired, the money has dried up. And as that money has dried up, it's no longer masking the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so those impacts are really starting to become very glaring for us now. And that's one of the reasons why we saw such a troubling and disconcerting May revise this past May, and a lot of these cuts that we had to make to the California state budget. I'd assume we're going to see more cuts to the California budget next year. We're going to have more cuts to the federal budget as well, unless we want to continue running up our national debt. So, like the gentleman on the screen with those empty pockets, unfortunately, at least for the near future, that's probably what our future of public budgeting is going to look like. And that is it. And that is it for me. That covers all the information that we cover in this course. We talked about managing human resources, managing fiscal resources. You now have the information that you need to do those scenarios on the final assessment as well. Any questions, observations, or clarifications in our final couple minutes together on managing fiscal resources or any of this information that we have discussed? If not, then that concludes our Zoom session for tonight and our Zoom session for this abbreviated semester together. We do not have a Zoom session scheduled for next Tuesday. All you'll be doing next Tuesday is finishing up your final assessment, making sure to get that final assessment submitted by midnight. I will then grade those as quickly and dutifully as I can and try and get your final grades all wrapped up no later than probably Thursday of next week. You can then move onward and upward. If you have a second half hybrid course, you can move on to your second half hybrid course. If you don't have a second half hybrid course, then you have a little bit more free time on your hands through the rest of the semester to do what you would like. But just make sure you get that final assessment turned in by midnight next Tuesday. Okay. Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I wish you all great success in your future in the MPA program. Hopefully this course has given you a good foundational footing to move forward in your core courses, and hope it will serve you well in the future. And I hope to see you in future courses in the program. So take care, everyone. Have a great week, and I hopefully will talk to you in the future. So take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.